Following speaker is Frances Gage. She's Associate Professor of Art History at Buffalo State SUNY, a historian of 16th and 17th century Italian art and criticism, collecting intellectual culture and medicine. She is the author of the book Painting as Medicine in Early Modern Rome, Giulio Mancini and the Efficacy of Art, as well as numerous articles and essays. These have appeared in the journals Burlington Magazine, Intellectual History Review, Nuncius, Renaissance Studies, and Renaissance Quarterly. She is a contributor to Conserving Health in Early Modern Culture, edited by Sandro Cavallo and Tessa Story, Caravaggio, Reflections and Refractions, edited by Lorenzo Pericolo and David Stone, The Display of Art in the Roman Palace, 1550 to 1750, edited by Gail Feigenbaum, with Francesco Ferolini, Collecting Religious Art in Italy, also edited by Gail Feigenbaum, who's appeared many times today, and Sybil Ebert Schifferer and the Academia Seminars, edited by Peter Lucart. In 2016, she co-curated with Dr. Christina Nielsen the exhibition A Picture of Health, Art and the Mechanisms of Healing at the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College. Her work has been supported by many organizations, including the American Philosophical Society, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the Folger Shakespeare Library, the NEH, the Newberry Library, the Renaissance Society of America, and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. She is currently writing a book on art and provocation in early modern Italy. Dr. Gage.
Thank you, Louisa, and I'd like to thank the Center for this very kind invitation to present my research to you. Thank you all for coming. The Sienese physician and art critic, Giulio Mancini, who you heard about when Hannah spoke to you, writing in his considerations on painting about pricing, argued that painting is not a necessity, but an object of pleasure. As a consequence, there would be considerable latitude in the price of pictures. Value would be determined not only by issues of supply and demand, but also, and more crucially, by social factors, including the rank of patron and of the artist, the master's fame and reputation, and whether he is rich or poor. If the buyer were of middling status, the price would be that agreed upon. But if he were a prince or a man of means, there would be a different price, one equivalent to a gift, or a counter-gift for courtesies and services received. If rich Roman patrons conventionally rewarded top artists beyond their merits, it is less clear how Romans reached conclusions about the appropriate parity of values within a gift exchange, particularly if this traded luxury objects for services. What were the implications on pricing if services included an important patron's promotion of an artist? Given the ambiguous moral status accorded to wealth and luxury objects in the early modern world, and in which social status rested upon perceived virtue, and where riches might be justified if they constituted an instrument to carry out virtuous deeds, what role did honor play in pricing and the nascent art market in 17th century Rome? Mancini, as physician and scholar, belonged to Rome's literary elite, but for most of his life, he could not compete with princely or even wealthy patrons in the acquisition of works by famous artists. Shortly after Urban VIII's ascent to the throne in 1623, Mancini was named papal physician, a position in which he received loyal support from the Pope, even being promoted to Canon of St. Peter's in 1626. The Barberini expressed greatest enthusiasm for Mancini's medical learning, but also generously supported his activities as art critic, historian, and letterato. Michele Maccarini reveals that Urban had promised Mancini the opportunity to shape the commission for the baldacchino in St. Peter's, though this did not transpire. What this nonetheless demonstrates is that Mancini had reason to conceive of himself as a cultural arbiter and to burnish his reputation in this regard. Installed as papal physician, Mancini was better positioned now to collect works by leading artists, such as Guercino and Cavaliere d'Arpino. Often he received these as gifts, but he also commissioned works from artists in Siena whose fortunes he could establish. A protracted dispute over payment to Giovanni Lanfranco for an altarpiece Mancini commissioned in the late 1620s sheds crucial light on the questions opening this paper. The dispute arose after the death of Mancini on August 22nd, 1630. Giulio's estate was to pass to his brother Deifabo, residing in Siena. Logistics presented the first set of challenges. Travel for an elderly man like Deifabo was difficult in the best of circumstances. But in late spring and summer of 1630, a virulent epidemic of plague had broken out in central and northern Italy, and we can see the effects of the plague-ridden Bologna at the bottom of the picture by Rennie. Though Rome was still spared in late 1630, and although Deifabo's presence there was thought urgent, he was warned he would be inevitably quarantined. This must have all but convinced him not to embark on the trip. Instead, friends and family members in the Eternal City negotiated on his behalf, keeping up a lively correspondence, sometimes writing multiple missives in a single day to update him. Chief amongst these was Cesare Perini, the Mancini brothers' nephew, who was the executor of Giulio Mancini's estate, and more significantly, who had been Mancini's secretary and assistant in the papal court, and was intimately familiar with Giulio's affairs. Shortly after Mancini died, however, Perini had been thrown into prison for having received the estate of his former lover, a fallen woman. Giulio, who had been following Lanfranco since at least 1624, when he was intending to commission a portrait of the Pope, had requested an altarpiece, now lost, of the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew for the family chapel in Siena's San Martino. Lanfranco's surviving letters to Deifabo do not explicitly mention the payment he sought. Friends of Deifabo declared that Lanfranco was asking for at least 500 scudi, though he pressed for as much as 700. Deifabo's supporters quickly came to realize that there were two thorny problems to resolve. First, the final price for the picture, and secondly, the amount Lanfranco had already received by way of payment and payment in kind. Although the dispute arose between Lanfranco and Deifabo, many individuals were drawn into it. Almost all were members of a tight-knit circle in the papal court, who knew much about each other's behavior and attitudes, and who shared similar artistic, cultural, and social expectations. This might have assured a smooth path to resolution. Many of those involved pressed for a mutually satisfying conclusion. While Perini remained in prison, negotiations on behalf of Deifabo were chiefly carried out by Giulio Mancini's good friend, the apothecary Giovanni Battista Paolucci. He declared more than once to Deifabo that he was also a friend of the artist, though he underscored that he was not taking sides. He just wanted justice done. But Paolucci, like Deifabo, thought the price for the martyrdom was exorbitant. Lanfranco may have thought that insisting this business be wrapped up while Perini remained in prison would work in his favor, for those with a stake in negotiations would be constrained to rely on second-hand reports by men each claiming to know the mind of Giulio Mancini better than the other. Lanfranco declared to Paolucci that Giulio had said he wished to pay him well. Other reports favoring the artist also swirled about. One of Lanfranco's allies in this conflict was Giulio's former medical assistant and protege, Sebastiano Vanini. Also on the side of Lanfranco was the letterato, of course, and associate of Mancini, Ferrante Carlo. Carlo allegedly claimed to Paolucci that Giulio had declared he wished to provide the dowry for one of Lanfranco's daughters in exchange for the altarpiece. Paolucci wasn't convinced, and this surely would have constituted wild largesse of the sort Mancini never demonstrated. But the powerful patrons in the papal court may have wished their clients to believe they were capable of in the hopes of eliciting more faithful service. Lanfranco's earliest surviving letter to Deifobo, dated 16th of November, 1630, mentioned none of these rumors, but pressed for a stima, an appraisal, a move the artist knew would benefit him, provided it occurred in Rome, where prices for pictures were higher than in Siena. Lanfranco openly threw down the gauntlet, adding that an appraisal would more quickly raise the picture's price than lower it. This Deifobo's supporters knew to be all too true. Paolucci would caution Deifobo that wolves don't eat wolves, meaning artists would not turn against their own. Yet Lanfranco also inadvertently encouraged Deifobo's camp to begin comparative pricing, a move that was also not damaging initially to the painter. Paolucci, again, evidently wished to remain an equitable negotiator. Although Lanfranco's asking price was high, Paolucci had bad news for Deifobo. Paintings smaller than the Martyrdom were going for 500 scudi, and a large public work such as Christ summoning Peter, which he said was smaller by half than the Martyrdom, reaped Lanfranco 1,100 scudi, according to Paolucci. The actual documents say 1,000 scudi. Further sounding a word of caution, Paolucci recounted how a picture Lanfranco had painted for a Lucchese gentleman, for which he had received 500 scudi, was valued at 800 when put to a stima. A formal appraisal was finally avoided, but this did not deter Deifobo's camp from seeking informal evaluations from anyone and everyone, painters and other artisans, medical professionals, and friends. Anytime somebody happened to come by, they would and could easily access the picture, they would be asked to have a view of it. Moreover, these evaluations continued well after the dispute with the artist was resolved, for the issue of quality and pricing continued, as Deifobo's supporters confronted the issue of whether and how to dispose of the picture once they determined it was not to go to the chapel in San Martino. 2 weeks after the initial letter to Deifobo, Lanfranco sent a second in which he changed tactics, this time justifying the price by considering size and number of figures, 14 or 15 of them, life size, as well as characteristics of his style. Among those elements proving the painting worthy were the invention, expression, and colorito. The concetto of figures, according to Lanfranco, resulted from the great toil of mind and hand he had devoted to the work, and from the considerable time in its creation. If Lanfranco wished to claim ingenio, he was not above stressing the sheer labor he had put into this. In these features, Lanfranco's missive was consistent with contemporary considerations of pricing as investigated by Philip Sohm and Richard Spear. But in this letter of the 30th of November, Lanfranco had dramatically changed his tone, a factor that Paolucci did not fail to comment upon the following month when remarking that Lanfranco had now entered the boxing ring. In this second letter to Deifobo, Lanfranco refrained from many conventional demonstrations of courtesy. Quote, "The last letter of Vostra Signoria has given me incredible disgust for the scarcity of money you say you have, for the delay, for the little satisfaction that you place in the work, lowering the price and demanding a sketch," unquote. Lanfranco threatened to sell the picture and be done with it. Calling attention to his own honorable service to Monsignor Mancini, Lanfranco further berated his correspondent for his apparent artistic ignorance, demanding a sketch after the painting was executed. Quote, "If I have not sent you the disegno, it is because after the work is finished, it is impossible by even the most diligent man to give judgment of a work that is painted with unspeakable effort. I am stupefied that Vostra Signoria says he wants to show the disegno to men of the profession in Siena." Unquote. Deiphobos was cast as ignorant of painting and was dishonorable in failing to make good on an already, supposedly, agreed upon price. Worse still, Lanfranco's tone implied Deiphobos was a social inferior. Lanfranco's cutting manner, which only devolved further in the following months, was surely unwise in the long run, but from his perspective, it was not unjustified. Having been knighted by the Barberini family 2 years earlier, the painter proudly supported the insignia of the Order of Christ in his self-portrait, and Lanfranco could confidently boast the support of the most powerful art patrons in Italy. He also must have recognized that next to his own compelling claims to social and cultural privilege, Deiphobos could not even stage a faint comparison, for with Giulio now dead, Deiphobos was losing papal patronage. Giulio had already been replaced by the new papal physician, Taddeo Collicola, who was all too eager to show his support for the Parmese painter. Moreover, by early 1631, when the battle over the picture still raged, Lanfranco held the prestigious position of Principe of the Accademia di San Luca under the patronage of Cardinal Francesco Barberini. If Lanfranco sought to diminish Deiphobos' social and intellectual standing, his supporters quickly called into question Lanfranco's character, bemoaning the fact that the painter had not mentioned anything of the payments he had already received in kind from Monsignor Mancini for the martyrdom. Already on the 23rd of November, and while still in prison, Perini remarked that, quote, "I marvel that Lanfranco says he hasn't had anything, having had wood, wine, oil, and candles more than 100 scudi worth," unquote. A week later, Paolucci echoed this sentiment, noting that the artist only acknowledged 40 scudi worth. Even so, Perini extended to Lanfranco the benefit of the doubt. With the artist denying that he had received anything, even while knowing that Perini had been the one to record these payments, Perini had to conclude, or to hope, that, as he wrote, quote, "I hold him to be a man of good conscience," unquote. Once Perini was free, as Paolucci noted, he would surely consult the papal account books, a danger Lanfranco seemingly had not considered. Yielding up further information, Paolucci reported to Deiphobos that not only had Perini claimed that Lanfranco had received 150 scudi worth of household supplies, not just 100, but more importantly, Paolucci recalled that Giulio Mancini had intended to pay Lanfranco only 250 or 300 scudi at most, nothing anywhere near Lanfranco's persistent claim of 500 or more. Once raised, the question of payments in kind came to be intricately interwoven with the issue of gifts and services, for Lanfranco countered these charges with a list of other works he had produced for Monsignor. First, however, the painter reminded Deiphobos how his treatment, Deiphobos, was so far inferior to that of his brother, unquote. Or, quote, "I am sure that I would have been treated better by Monsignore, who would have treated me better than you can even imagine," unquote. Lanfranco's point was to stress Deiphobos' obligations to act in accordance with the rank of the painting's original patron, who should have been operating within a gift economy. Lanfranco went on, quote, "If he had taken the painting as a gift, he would have done me the ultimate favor, because to him remained the obligation to satisfy me more than my merits," unquote. Did Mancini, notorious for his shrewd dealing when it came to selling art, adopt a posture of tremendous liberality with the assumption of a high-ranking position in the church? It seems unlikely because Perini lamented the fact that Mancini bought used livery for his household. But, in fact, Paolucci revealed that Mancini always added a sum for pleasure to the cost of a picture. This was apparently carefully calibrated, however, at some 100 scudi, a rather generous amount for such gifts. With correspondence in full swing, each side inflated their claims of gifts and services ever further, insisting that Deifobo's offer of 300 scudi was rather too low. Lanfranco, on the 27th of December, listed off many of the other paintings, all of which are lost, and their prices, they were all inexpensive, that Mancini had received from him for his collection, including the lost Mars and Venus in a landscape, a head of an apostle, a female half-length, a landscape, an adoration, etc. There were others beyond this that the painter didn't individually list that he said he had provided in exchange for services from Mancini, having visited his family, not as principal physician, but as an alternate. Bringing in Mancini's services as a physician was dangerous enough, for it encouraged even further counterclaims. But Lanfranco's fatal miscalculation was to boast of Giulio's power to promote him, with the intent of eliciting Deifobo's jealousy of his deceased brother and shaming him into paying up. Quote, "Monseigneur was such that with a single word he could enrich me," unquote. But when the following day Lanfranco met Perini, now out of prison, and after expressing sorrow at the death of Monseigneur, insisted that Mancini hadn't done anything for him, Perini immediately hit back with a withering rejoinder. He reported to Deifobo, "It was necessary to respond to him as I responded, telling him that he lied, because from the deceased Monsignor Zio, Monsignor uncle, he had received every kind of service, Mancini having dragged friends and patrons along to favor him to have work, as he had done with the work in San Paolo, the painting in San Pietro, and the knighthood, and other medium-sized and large works, which he had from more and diverse people, and when there was no one, Mancini was there and followed him, I being most informed about this. And Mancini was there to make him known and give him satisfaction. And because he desired to serve him, he made Nostro Signore come to see his work in the cupola of San Andrea della Valle. Similar princes don't move to see paintings. There are other painters, valentuomini, and not inferior to Lanfranco, who have not had such honors at the end of their work," unquote. Perini thought his diatribe was effective. For at the end of it, he said, Lanfranco, quote, "remained ashamed and didn't know what to say, and he left mortified," unquote. In this outburst, Perini established Mancini as the forger of the recent taste for Lanfranco in the Barberini court, a cultural force who secured major commissions for the artist, such as the extensive cycle of paintings produced for the Chapel of the Holy Sacrament in San Paolo fuori le Mura. In addition to this, Perini attributed to Mancini the source of Lanfranco's social preference and the papal gesture of honoring Lanfranco's assumption in the cupola of San Andrea. Such a central role comes as something of a surprise to scholars accustomed to thinking of the Barberini as patrons confident enough that they did not need to defer to others or consult the preferences of others. Furthermore, Lanfranco was neither young nor known in Rome. Yet it is clear that Urban actively sought out artistic opinions among the members of his court, and in these years, Giulio explicitly sought to create opportunities in which Urban would see the paintings of Giulio's artist protégés in order to secure further commissions for them, such as he did also with Francesco Rustici in early 1625. When the Sacchetti family turned their attention away from Lanfranco to Pietro da Cortona in 1624, shortly after Mancini had entered the papal court, the Sienese physician no doubt saw an opportunity. Such valuable services could only have made it more difficult for Lanfranco to claim he was owed at least 500 scudi for the martyrdom. When a new supporter entered the fray in early 1631, it appeared that the painter was grasping at straws in the hopes of mounting some other persuasive argument for the payment he desired. The rector of the Hospital of Santa Maria della Scala in Siena, Agostino Gage, a friend of the Mancini brothers, and a man known for his prudence and judgment, reported that Lanfranco had been to see him to beg for payment so that he could purchase more colors. With only those pigments currently in his studio, he was unable to finish the picture. As Perini shortly thereafter recognized, too many individuals had had a hand in this business. It was best to rely on Gage alone, he thought. Gage's letters to de Foucault demonstrate that he pressed to scale back negotiations to the question of the pricing of the altarpiece itself and its artistic quality, leaving aside those claims of gifts given and services rendered. In this context, too, however, the role of Mancini as tastemaker emerged clearly, having a direct effect on the pricing. Gage reported on the 4th of January that he had been to see the painting again and was not entirely satisfied. Quote, "It is full of crudeness," unquote. He went on. Quote, "It doesn't appear to me to be decorous in the disposition of figures. There's hardness in the disegno, and that is what I dislike more than anything," unquote. On the positive side, the painting is large, the figures are right, and they compose a fruitful concert. Additionally, it's also true, Gage reflected, quote, "that there are some good and vivacious figures, which will have been those that were done when Giulio Mancini was alive," unquote. But he concluded the rest had been dragged down to be made worse than it had been. Gage then concluded that if it were not for the fact that Lanfranco conventionally received 500 scudi for other paintings, this price would appear exorbitant. The martyrdom, quote, "merits little more than 300, and if de Foucault were to pay 400, he would have paid too dearly," unquote. The question of Giulio Mancini's contribution to the style, quality, and invention of the martyrdom could have potentially represented a point of agreement for all involved. The assumption on both sides was the greater the patron's imprint on a picture, the more he would be satisfied with the final product, equating to a potentially higher price. Lanfranco reported that he had tirelessly sought to please Mancini by, quote, "doing and undoing the painting repeatedly," unquote, and this justified the high asking price. But Gage had evidently tracked the progress of the work for months, and having noted a decline, he attributed it to Giulio's absence from the equation, and this could only bring about a reduction in value. The effects of this episode on the artistic culture of Rome and the city's nascent art market were potentially significant, even as this case demonstrates the sometimes incommensurable value of goods and services in a culture of honor. De Foucault paid up 360 scudi that Paolucci had always encouraged him to pay, which, with somewhere between 40 and 150 scudi that Lanfranco had supposedly received in payments in kind, added up to possibly 400 or possibly 500 or more scudi. More than the 250 or 300 scudi that Mancini had originally hoped to spend, but less than the 500 additional scudi that Lanfranco still sought. Did this episode negatively affect Lanfranco's successive career in Rome? Lanfranco's obstinacy in negotiations, his insulting tone, could not have enhanced his reputation. Reputation, again, being a critical factor, according to Mancini, in price evaluation. In fact, members of de Foucault's camp spread the news of the artist's behavior throughout the papal court. It was reported that Cassiano del Pozzo, who was, quote, "very well informed of the painter's obligations to Monsignor Mancini, was disgusted by the brute manner of Lanfranco's speech," unquote. Even if the even if the resolution to the dispute eventually came down to the artistic qualities of the work, the damage had been done. Lanfranco's reputation had been altered in the process. But how much? Did his knighthoods really protect him at this point? Or did his wealth or his lifestyle offset his ignoble speech when it came to reputation? It's not ultimately entirely clear. Those involved in the protracted dispute were so closely interconnected that the artist and Deiphobos only narrowly escaped being brought together yet again in another controversy. As Perini reported, on the 11th of July, 1631, a Sicilian diamond merchant who had purchased the contents of Lanfranco's studio had offered to buy the martyrdom for 600 scudi, that is, if Deiphobos wanted payment in jewels. Deiphobos apparently did not, saving Perini from the trial of the diamond thief Don Fabrizio Valguarnara, into which Lanfranco was just about to be catapulted. Thank you.